Get ready for a special episode of Noon with Kevin McFarlane. From his humble beginnings as an EMT to his current role as a dedicated nurse, Kevin's journey is one fueled by passion and unwavering commitment to emergency nursing. As the host of the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast and the co-host of How Not to Kill Your Patient, Kevin's expertise shines through his insightful discussions and invaluable contributions to the healthcare community. Kevin is not only a dear friend, but also the reason I embarked on this podcasting journey. I am honored to have him join us for today's episode, where we'll explore his remarkable career trajectory, his love for the work he does, and the inspiration behind his podcasting ventures. Join us as we celebrate Kevin's impactful career and friendship and gain valuable insights into the world of emergency nursing. This episode promises to be an enlightening and inspiring experience you won't want to miss. Let's get started. All right, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on the Noon podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Sam. How are you?
I'm doing great, brother, man. I really appreciate that we got the time to get together finally. It's been a little work in progress for a bit.
Absolutely. I'm so glad. I'm honored to be on the podcast. That you've had amazing guests. So I'm thrilled and honored to be part of that.
I really appreciate that. Can I go ahead and get an introduction?
Sure. So my name is Kevin McFarlane. I am an emergency nurse out of El Paso, Texas. Longtime Albuquerque resident. Worked as a EMT and as a tech in the ER, and then became an ER nurse and never looked back. It was a great decision for me. I work as a house supervisor now, full time, and then part time. I have a podcast. I have a couple podcasts. One called "How Not to Kill Your Patient," which is a little bit more clinical, and then another podcast called "The Art of Emergency Nursing." So I do that. Do a little bit of speaking on the side. Do a little bit of education on the side.
You are a super busy guy. Super busy.
It's it too. You know, the bad thing about loving what you do is it makes it easy to say yes to a lot of different things. So
that's fantastic. What a great way to put it. Before we get too far into it, your wife also has a podcast. Is that correct?
She does. She's seen how much fun I was having doing my podcast. So she decided she was going to jump in on it too. And she started a podcast called the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast because she is a transplant survivor, and she decided she wanted to interview other transplant survivors from around the world. So she does a podcast as well, and she's having a blast doing it. She hasn't looked back. There'll be times that we'll be sitting there both working on our podcast, her in her office and me in mine, and just kind of tinkering away on our podcasts.
That's so much fun. And she didn't have like a very common transplant. Is that correct?
No, she had a double lung transplant just over 5 years ago, and it has done amazing since. It was a blessing, an absolute miracle. Everything worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. That's why we actually left Albuquerque. We actually left Albuquerque to go to Houston for her to get that transplant, and it went amazingly well.
That's fantastic. And the transition was fairly easy for you as a nurse to go and find another position?
Yeah. The good thing about being a nurse is there's jobs everywhere, right? Like you can go anywhere and find a job. And I found an amazing job when I went out there to Houston. And then when I transitioned again to El Paso, same thing. Like it was easy to find a job. So that's one of the advantages of being a nurse is there's plenty of job opportunities out there. It's just a matter of, finding a good fit.
So finding the right fit, right? You have like an entire alphabet after your name.
I do. I have a few nursing certifications that go after my name. I am a certified emergency nurse, certified trauma nurse. I have a certification in nurse leadership, nurse executive leadership, certification in nursing professional development. And then the credential I'm probably the most proud of that I got not too long ago is what's called a fellowship. I'm a fellow in the Academy of Emergency Nursing, which is an honorific title for folks who've made lasting contributions to the profession of emergency nursing. So last year, or about a year and a half ago now, I was inducted into the academy, one of 200 people in the world inducted into the academy. That again, it's honoring people who made a what they call an enduring contribution to the practice of emergency nursing, and it was all based on my podcast. That this was kind of an ingenious way to get information out and do education in a novel way that hadn't been done before. So I got inducted into the academy, which was a huge honor. You look at the first time I went to an academy meeting and I was looking around, and I mean, there were legends of emergency nursing there. And I'm like going, and they're going to let me hang out here too. This is cool. So,
All because of a
uh,
podcast, huh?
all because of a podcast. And when it's funny, when I first got approached to apply for the academy, I said, nobody's going to let me in the academy just for getting on a podcast and talking shit with my friends.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. And that's exactly what did happen. So, but we talk crap, but we do educate a little bit as well. So
As long as there's a
um,
little bit of education, right? Then you're
there's a
doing.
little bit of education there. And the person who actually convinced me to finally apply was a newer nurse who, one night we were there at a conference, and she was telling me, she's like, you're kind of the one who helps us connect to these people who've come before us and learn the lessons that they have to teach. And she's like, I feel like I know people because I've heard them on your podcast. I feel like I know you because I've heard your podcast. And man, it was just an honor for her to say that. And that's what actually finally convinced me to go ahead and apply for the academy. And I was thrilled to find out that I got in. It was quite the honor.
That is really cool. And I did not realize how big of a celebrity I was going to have on today's show.
I am a celebrity to a very, very small group of people.
Oh,
Uh,
that's not true. Your podcasts are actually really high. I don't remember what they were, but when I looked at the listennotes.com, and I don't know, I mean, it's important to me, right? Because it tells me that I'm top 10% in the world right now. But for you, you were really high. Like, I don't want to short you, but it was either 5% or 0.5%, which was amazing. That is amazingly high.
I've been blessed that when I first came out with this podcast, I figured it'd be me and my wife and like five other people listening. And I'm thrilled to find out that more people than that want to listen to this podcast. So it's an honor. I'm humbled by it every day. And when I go to these conferences and I meet these people, and this one lady goes, I feel like we're best friends. I feel like I've known you forever. And I'm like, I have no idea who you are, but I'm really glad you listen to the podcast. So it's been cool. It's been really cool. So it's opened up doors. I had a chance to have conversations with people that I never would have had a conversation with otherwise. Got to interview celebrities in emergency nursing, celebrities, period. Um, so it's been pretty cool.
It's really impressive that you not only have one, but you have two podcasts altogether. I mean, just doing this one takes a lot of work. One podcast is an amazing amount of work. What prompted you to start that?
So I I was a big podcast fan, and I listened to a lot of podcasts from way back when, before podcasts were really popular. Um, I listened to before podcasts. I listened to a lot of AM talk radio overnight when I was working overnight at Motorola a million years ago. Um, and I love talk radio. I love listening to people talk, hearing people tell stories. And I bought all the equipment. I was like, I'm going to start a podcast. And I bought the equipment and had the equipment. And then I was like, I don't really know what I'm going to podcast about. And it sat in a drawer and I didn't do anything with it. And then one day I was at a conference. I was at a National Emergency Nursing Association conference, and it was a leadership conference. It was leaders of the organization. And we were sitting around a table one night having dinner. And as oftentimes do, we get to telling stories, and it's those one-upper stories, right? Like, oh, you had one of those, I had one of those. Let me tell you about my. I was listening to this group of nurses tell stories, and some were sad, some were hilarious, some were happy, like amazing stories. And I thought to myself, if I could just plop a microphone down right in the table, that would be an interesting podcast. And that kind of spawned the idea. I came back and said, okay, I wanna this is the podcast I want to make. And so then I came back home from that trip and started kind of putting the idea together. And I was inspired by another podcaster who is an EMS podcaster who has a podcast called The Q Word. And I talked to her a little bit and said, hey, I'd always been thinking about starting a podcast. Tell me about it. And she told me a little bit about it. And she said, record 4 or 5 episodes and see if it's something you want to do. And if it is, release them and keep going. If it's not, then walk away from it with nothing to lose. And I did. And it was amazing. And I haven't stopped yet. It's been, gosh, almost 4 years that I've been doing the podcast,
Wow.
doing the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. The second podcast, How Not to Kill Your Patient, that was kind of a brainchild, something a little bit more clinical with my friend Dr. Lisa Wolf, who is a celebrity in the emergency nursing circle, a researcher, an author, amazing, amazing person. And we were like, hey, let's do a more clinical podcast and do short kind of clinical vignettes, really kind of focusing off triage and that initial assessment. But then we talk about, things like burnout. We talk about, violence in the emergency department, all those kinds of like kind of heavy topics.
That sounds pretty heavy.
It can be. It can be. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a fun podcast to do, and she's amazing to do the podcast with. And it hasn't, that one's not quite as downloaded as Art of Emergency Nursing, but it's still, a little bit newer. But both have gotten amazing feedback.
That's amazing. And really amazing that you had somebody to help you kind of get started. And I do have to tell you, thank you, because you prompted me. I approached you and I said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. What do I need to do? And you just told me, just record. Yep. Just get it started.
Just get started. Just get some equipment and start recording. Just do it.
Right. It doesn't even have to be fancy, right? Like just
no. You can do kind of bare bones and still get something okay. And look what you've created. You've created an amazing community of EMS providers and more. And like how many people have heard your story now and heard other people's story through you.
Yeah. Hopefully it's good. I that is fantastic, dude. I really love that. And I love that you have gone into more of a clinical route. And between you and Lisa, how do you decide what your topics are going to be when you are like pre-planning for an episode?
So we had a kind of a general idea of these are the kind of topics we wanted to do. I do kind of almost like a review of systems. And then it kind of became, we were kind of like, I don't know. And then it really kind of becomes like, what pisses you off? Like, what's pissing you off right now? Let's talk about that. So, and I have a Facebook group that has, nurses from all over the world in it. And in that Facebook group, the most recent episode that we're going to release probably today or tomorrow, there was a nurse who is a brand new nurse who said, who commented about how she was 3 weeks in and feels completely overwhelmed. And I'm like, you're 3 weeks in. Of course you're overwhelmed. And she said, if I could just memorize these protocols, then I'll be good. And I'm like, no, don't memorize the protocols. You got to know why you're doing the protocols. So I just kind of posed that question to Lisa Wolf and said, wind her up and said, okay, go and let's talk about this. And we did. And it was a great conversation. Same thing happened with burnout. We were talking about burnout, and I was actually at an emergency nursing conference, and a lot of people were talking about how burned out they were. And I called Lisa and said, hey, we need to do an episode on burnout. And she's like, done, got it. So,
huge topic. Like you said, heavy. How do you
heavy topics?
I mean, you're so busy all the time. You're recording at least 4 episodes a month, and you're working. Are you working full time?
Yep, work full time.
Yeah, dude, you're crazy. How do you prevent yourself from getting burned out?
It's easy to not get burned out when you love what you do. And, I'm lucky in that I work a full-time job, but I work 3 days one week and 4 days the next. So it doesn't seem too bad. It gives me a few days off during the week to do other things and follow these passion projects that I have. And when you love what you do, it makes it easy to do. But it also makes it easy to say yes to other things too, right? So the risk is always taking on too much because you're
Hmm.
like, ooh, that sounds kind of interesting, and that sounds kind of interesting, and that sounds kind of interesting. The next thing you know, you look at your project list and you're like going, I got a lot to do. So
Yeah, how do you fit the honeydews in, you know?
gosh, they're gonna fit in. Otherwise, it's gonna be a long I'll be sleeping on the couch. So we fit them in every now and then.
Happy wife, happy life.
Happy wife, happy life. Amen, sister.
There's no truer words than that, correct? Actually,
Right?
today's my 19-year anniversary with my wife.
What? And
I
you're on a
know.
podcast?
I know.
Okay, we're shutting this off right now. Go be with your wife. You
She
don't need to be
loves
listening
me.
to me.
She
She
knows.
must. Yeah, you're
She knows.
you're the one who's gonna end up in trouble here. You're gonna be the one in the doghouse.
I know. She's really easy though. Like just some ice cream and I'll be good. You know, donuts.
Sounds like a woman after my own heart.
Exactly. Exactly. No, I love the shit. Obviously, I love the crap out of her because we've been together for, like I said, 19 years. It's been a long
It's a
road.
long time.
Yeah,
It's a long
it's
time.
impressive. And not to get too political, but we've only been married for this year will be 8 years.
It's a long time too.
A lot of people ask, like, why'd you wait so long to get married? Being in the world that we are today,
Because you couldn't.
yeah, it wasn't legal and now it's legal. So we got married basically. Well, we waited a little bit just to see if they were going to redact their decision because they did
Yeah.
that in New Mexico. But once it was allowed, we went ahead and tied the knot. And really, it hasn't done anything. It's just a piece of paper. But
But what it does give you some legal protection if something was to happen to her or something was to
yes,
happen to you. You got a little bit of
yes,
legal protection there. So,
yes, very true, very true. So, how long have you and your wife been married?
oh gosh, we've been married for 17 years, I think. I think about 17 years. So long time,
Yeah, that's
long time.
impressive. That's I think once you get past the like 15-year hump, you're good, right? Like
For any woman to put up with me for that long, it's just pretty impressive. So,
I feel that. I feel that on
yeah.
my side too. How, if you are okay talking about it, how difficult was it pre-transplant? Like, I don't know how sick she was or the events leading up to it. I only have my experiences with my wife who has multiple autoimmune disorders, and there are days that can be hard. I imagine pre-transplant that was probably pretty hard for you guys.
There were, there were certainly some hard days, but my wife's a trooper, man. She never let it slow her down. My wife had cystic fibrosis, and was progressing to the point where she was going to need the lung transplant. But you wouldn't have known it. It didn't slow her down. She was still hard charging, even if she had to wear oxygen to do it. She was still pretty hard charging, and even when she went on the list, she was like, she was kind of like, okay, I think I'm ready, but like I don't feel like she didn't feel as bad as she thought maybe she should for to require a transplant. Um, but the difference from pre-transplant to post-transplant is phenomenal, like amazing. I mean, she was on 6 liters of oxygen most of the time, um, pre-transplant, and I remember when she was kind of waking up after the transplant, she was looking at her sat on the monitor, and she's like, "What's my sat?" And I said, "It's 100%." She goes, "How many liters am I on?" I'm like, "Not on oxygen."
Oh,
And she was like, "Oh." She goes like this, "Oh, well, okay." And does amazing, and celebrates it every year, on her transplant anniversary, and celebrates it every day. I mean, she's amazing. She's done a lot. She's trying to she's trying to do a lot to give back to the transplant community. So that's really cool. She wants people's journey to be as good as hers was. Hers went incredibly smooth. And we're just thankful. We're blessed.
That is amazing. That is so amazing. And for you, I mean, we know it's hard for the patient, right? But we often forget, how hard it is for the family members as well.
Oh, it's not easy. It's not easy when
No.
you're, you're there and you know your loved one just doesn't feel good. Like just breathing is a struggle, and when you have loved ones who have chronic diseases or acute or chronic diseases, you just hate seeing them not feel good. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible situation. So, how did you or why did you end up in El Paso?
so we wanted to get a little bit closer. We wanted to get her family is still in New Mexico, as is my family. So we wanted to be a little bit closer, but still kind of wanted to stay in Texas. So El Paso fit the bill pretty well. We're not too far from we live really close to the New Mexico border, so getting to New Mexico to visit family is super easy. And El Paso's been a pretty good community. Like it's not a bad community at all.
No, it really, it does it I would say as somebody who lived next to El Paso for many years, it did get shit on quite a bit as the armpit of Texas, but really it is a beautiful city.
It is a nice city. It's a safe city. When I first were just telling people we're moving there, they were like, "Isn't that kind of a scary place to be?" I'm like, "It's really not. It's actually a very safe city. Um, and it's been good. I mean, I joke too that it's the armpit of Texas, but it's actually not a bad place.
I mean, compared to even, the violence in Albuquerque, it's a
Oh,
lot safer than Albuquerque is, which is unfortunate, but that
and
is the way it's
and
moving.
yeah, and we looked at potentially going back to Albuquerque, and then just decided that wasn't the right time to do that. So
Yeah, and you can still get chili, right? Like you're still in a good place to get green chili. I know a lot of people that move away from New Mexico, that's like one of the main things they miss is chili.
yep, yeah, couldn't get that. Every time we come back to Albuquerque, we would come back to when we were living in Houston. We'd come back with a cooler full of chili, red chili, green chili, our favorite salsas, all that kind of stuff.
All the good
So
stuff you can't find anywhere else.
when we first moved to Houston, there was a little restaurant that was a New Mexican style food, and I was like, well, let's go try it, and it was amazing. It was great
Oh,
New Mexican food. But that was the only place in Houston that had anything even remotely like that. All the Mexican food in Houston is very different than in Albuquerque. Even in El Paso is very different from Albuquerque.
oh, I know. People don't believe me when I say like Las Cruces Mexican food is different than Albuquerque Mexican food, and I miss Las Cruces Mexican food.
It's I've had a little bit of Las Cruces, and Las Cruces Mexican food is more like Albuquerque than El Paso.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, yeah. El Paso it's just a little different. So
That's a good way of describing it.
yeah, it's not bad. It's just different.
It's just different. So, how do you feel about being in the position that you're in right now? Like, you're not doing really a lot of bedside nursing at this point.
No, I do. So I'm in a position called AOD, Administrator on Duty, or what some folks might know as a house supervisor. And the cool thing is, it's like the greatest leadership position because I get to lead when I'm there. When I'm gone, nobody's looking for me. Um, so that's kind of nice. But I do still get to get involved. I get to get involved in patient care. I attend all the codes and help out in all the codes, all the rapid responses. I help out there, and then just kind of help guide practice a little bit as much as I can at night when I'm working. So I still feel like I'm involved in patient care, but maybe not as directly involved in patient care. So
Oh, that's fantastic. And it sounds like a really neat and dynamic kind of role. I know that, and I don't know for your position specifically, but do you do a lot of like bed management?
yep, do a lot of bed management, a lot of kind of controlling the flow of the hospital and making sure that things are flowing, that people are getting out of the ER when we can get them out of the ER and up to the floors. So
So, out of all of the positions, the many positions that you've held as a nurse or as a tech, what would you say has been your most favorite?
Gosh, my favorite position was the ER tech position. And the reason why was the ER tech position was such a great position because where I did it, we had an amazing scope of practice. We got to do such amazingly cool things, and I had none of the responsibility, right? Like I remember, yeah, it was skills. We were just kind of tasking out skills. We were doing IVs, blood draws, splinting, suturing. We did all kinds of Foley's, NG tubes. We did all the skills that nursing was doing, some of the skills that the doctors were doing, and we had none of the responsibility. So it was really kind of a cool job, but it really kind of got me interested in the funny thing was, and if there's any techs in the ER listening to this, and I remember as a tech thinking to myself, well, I'm doing all the skills. I could do what the nurses do. Like that's easy. And I remembered as soon as I became a nurse, I realized that like there was a lot more thinking that has to happen. Is not just know the how to do something, but why you do something. Is the key. Like nurses, they're going to know their stuff and know why they're doing the things that they're doing. Where as a tech, you may or may not. And I worked with some amazing techs and some brilliant techs, but there was level of responsibility and the level of knowledge that the nurses have is a little bit different.
Yeah, no,
Um, and
that's
and
really cool.
and as far as the nursing role, I mean, I've been through such amazing roles. I was a nurse manager of an ED for a while. I worked at a transfer center for a little while and really enjoyed that. The house supervisor role has been great, and just being a bedside nurse, like just being a nurse and taking care of people, is something I really enjoy and something I really miss. Love the education role. That's another role that I really had a lot of passion for. So
I see a lot. This is a little off topic. As a nurse, and working in a flight position that I do now, we get a lot of new nurses that come in, not new nurses to flight, right? So to become a flight nurse in most companies, you have to have at least 3 to 5 years of ER experience or ICU experience. So they're not new nurses by any means, but new flight nurses that come in and they'll be doing these, critical calls, and then the majority of our flights are not considered critical, but I've heard multiple times from multiple different nurses that they really miss bedside nursing. And it's a funny thing because there's so many medics that are like, get me out of get me out of patient care, I'm
as
ready to
quickly
be
as
out of
possible.
patient care. Yes, like, what do you think the difference is there between the nurses and the medics, other than schooling, right? But like the
I
attitudes.
I think with nursing, there's a lot of nurses that say the exact same thing, right? Like there's a lot of nurses that are like, I just got to get away from the beds. Burnout is real, right? Like burnout is real. Nursing is hard. EMS is hard. Um, I feel like Sisyphus, rolling that rock up the hill just for it to come right back down. Um, and bedside nursing, bedside and stretcher side EMS is hard. It's hard work. You work your tail off, but you find out soon that you know changing your location doesn't necessarily change your it's still patient care. Like it's still taking care of people, whether you're doing it from behind a desk or if you're doing it from at the stretcher side. You're still caring for people, and hopefully that's still what you want to do. And if it's not, then go do something else. Like let me introduce you to our friends in carpentry, right? Like go do something else if this is truly no longer for you. And sadly, when people are burnt out, I think a lot of times they're the last to know, right? you know they don't realize that these are the people that show up on shift and you're like, oh god, I gotta work with Sam tonight, and she's
Yeah.
so negative. And and just kind of these people that just kind of suck the life out of you. You don't realize how burned out you are until you can go and have the courage to go do something else. And you're like, oh yeah, this is good. Like I know someone who is an ER nurse and was burnt out, like clearly, and would say, I'm burned out. And when he finally was out of the ER and doing something else, like he was like, I like nursing again. I'm like, that's good. I'm a big fan for trying other things. Um, the hard part is And, you know, when I was a tech, I looked at going to paramedic school and I applied for paramedic school. I had a conversation with Larry Cobb, who you probably remember, and some of your listeners may remember. And Larry Cobb was the person who ran the paramedic program at the time, the paramedic program there in Albuquerque. And I remember having a conversation with him, and he's like, "What's your long term goal?" And I was like, "I think I want to become a paramedic, work as a paramedic for a while." Flight was one of my goals at the time. Then I was like, and then do that for a little while, and then probably become a nurse. And he's like, "Kevin, if ultimately your goal is to be a nurse, just go be a nurse." He's like, because the reality is, as a paramedic, is if you get burned out on the streets, you either go into flight, you go into education, you go into operations, or you leave. That's it. And flight, you find, is the same bullshit as you know the streets, maybe to a lesser degree. Education,
Yeah.
you know, education is great if you can do it, if it's something that you can do and you can love. Um, and leadership is, if it's in your skill set and something you can do and something you can love, then great, good for you. Or you leave the profession. So, one of the things as a nurse is if I get tired of being an ER nurse, I can go be a discharge nurse, a care manager. I can go be a med surge nurse. I can go be an ICU nurse. There's a lot of different things I can do to where I can still keep learning my craft, but doing it in a different place.
Yeah, I really wish they had that type of a dynamic for paramedics because it's not like it used to be. And it's not to say that they don't still have certificate programs for paramedics, but there is a higher requirement now where it's almost like a 2 year, 2 to 4 year degree program, and it's hard to justify dropping that 4 year program just because you're not happy with your job anymore.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think and they keep raising the bar, right? Like,
Yeah.
paramedic used to be, you take a year long class and if it was a good class, it was a year long class. If it was a not so good class, you could probably do it a little bit faster. Um, and now with all the requirements and requiring degrees and things like that, like I mean, it's a legit career. Like and it's hard to then leave that, walk away from that and do something else. But you got to remember that, like, if you did leave that, if you said, hey, I'm kind of burnt out on being a street medic, maybe I'm going to go be a nurse. Well, good for you. There's definitely going to be more options there, but it's still taking care of patients.
Yeah.
And if that's what you're burnt out on, you may be just as unhappy being a nurse.
Yeah, no, it's
So
true. Maybe consider something else. So when you were
yeah,
a tech, were you an EMT basic?
as an EMT intermediate.
Intermediate? Fantastic. How was that pay difference going from an EMT intermediate to a nurse?
It's kind of funny. So true confession here. I was completely overpaid as a tech. So as a tech, I worked as a supervisor at the hospital for a long time as a tech, and then I went casual pool, and they didn't take all the money back. So I was making good money as a tech, and when I went to nursing school, I was actually working as an EMS instructor. So I had left the hospital, and I was working full time as a EMS faculty at the local community college, teaching EMT basic, EMT intermediate, and an ER tech course that they used to offer. And I was making more money there than I did as a nurse to start.
Oh no.
I took a pay cut when I became a nurse. I was making, I don't know, like $30 an hour or something, 35 or maybe even close to $40 an hour as an EMS instructor.
Holy smokes, dude.
I was making good money. And then I'll never forget and I think I was making like, I don't know, like $17 an hour or something like that as a tech. Like I was completely overpaid. And if anyone hears this that used to work with me, I'm sorry. You probably didn't want to know all this. Um, but and then I got my first nursing position, and I remember like getting my job offer, and it was 1997 an hour.
Oh man, dude. As a
And I was
brand new
like,
nurse.
as a brand new nurse, it was like 1997, and I was like going, this is really low. And they're like, they're like, oh, you're getting more because you're getting time for your hospital experience. I'm like going like I'm taking a pay cut to become a nurse. Like
That
I'm like,
probably
what do I
doesn't happen very often.
it doesn't happen very often. And so I just kept teaching after becoming a nurse and just, to supplement my income. But um yeah, I started in 19 like it was like 1997 or something like that, like just under $20 an
Mm,
hour as a nurse.
that's
So
rough. That's
and
rough.
now we can't get nurses to get out of bed for much more than that. So
Seriously, yeah. Come in for incentive pay. You better pay
yeah,
me $1,000 a shift, right?
yeah, yeah. So
Did you ever consider travel?
you know yes and no. I thought about it, but with my wife's health issues at the time, and just travel's hard. Like travel's hard if you're married and your spouse wants to have a life too, and not just want to be a housewife. Um, then travel gets hard. And certainly there was the time it was tempting, during COVID when the travel rates were so high. Um, it was certainly tempting, but it just wasn't in the cards for me. When I became a nurse, when I went to nursing school, I wanted to become a travel nurse. Was my goal was to be a travel nurse and flight nurse. And I've done a lot of travel as a nurse, but I've never been a travel nurse. I've certainly had the opportunity to travel all over the country, kind of in a nursing role, but never as a travel nurse. It just wasn't in the cards for me. And not that, I wouldn't do it down the road, or not that I would say no to that opportunity, but just hadn't worked out that way so far.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I had talked with Michelle from the Conversing Nurse podcast, and I really commended her for staying with her company for as long as she did, right? Because we just don't see nurses doing that anymore.
No, it doesn't happen much anymore. And certainly, the pandemic, like everybody left to go travel. And a lot of people were leaving for travel, and they were, going down the road or going across the country and making, incredible money. And now that money has not dried up, but it's kind of leveled a little bit more with what nurses are making. I think you can still make a little bit more as a travel nurse, but um, it kind of leveled out. But a lot of people were traveling, and a lot of people just don't stay. When I was a brand new tech in the ER, like the nurses that I worked with had all been nurses 10 plus years. Like you didn't work in that ER unless you'd been a nurse for, 10, 12, 15, 20 years. I worked with just incredible, amazing nurses. Like we didn't see 1 year nurses, and we certainly didn't see new grads. Um, and now, the ER that I work, the ER that I'm for the hospital I work at now, we have probably 5 or 6 new grads in the emergency department.
So, do you think that it is a hospital problem or a staff problem that we're having to go with brand new nurses, brand new paramedics?
I think it's both. I think certainly um, nurses now know their worth, and if they don't feel valued where they're at, they're going to go. So your goal as an organization or as a leader for an organization is to try to make them feel as valued as possible, so that they don't want to leave, right? But also, I think that people are realizing. I think nurses are realizing that you don't get extra points for staying at a place for 20 years, 30 years, where before that was highly valued. I don't think it's as valued anymore. I think people are kind of like, yeah, this is what people do now. They travel, they spend a year at one place and go on to the next. And um, you have these new grad nurses that want to come in and they want to be a traveler, the minute they graduate. And it's like, you're not even a safe nurse yet. Like there's no way you can be a travel nurse. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there's problems with the system. I think the system is not great. But also I think nurses are, you know, they know their value and they know that they can travel and go do something different.
So, do you think that's something that the hospital should be working on to try and increase their retention rate? Or do you think it's just something that it is what it is, move on and get over it?
I think every hospital would love to increase their retention rate. what I think I find is I think you find that some of your staff are going to be lifers. Like some of your staff are going to come in and they're not going to go anywhere. They don't want to go anywhere. They're used to this place. They like these doctors. They like this community. Um, and then other people are a little less, attached to an organization, attached to a place, and they'll go from one place to the next. So um, I don't know. I think it's a challenge for both. I think hospitals should try to ideally keep as many nurses as they can because it's hard to lose that institutional knowledge, right? Like it's hard to lose that institutional knowledge when all that institutional knowledge walks out the door. You're like, gosh, who still knows this? Like who's gonna know, that this is the way Doctor so and so likes to do things. And you value your people who get in and stay in. And what I think during COVID we found that like about a third of our staff left and went somewhere else. Um, I'd say probably a third to a half went and started doing traveling, but a bunch stayed. They did, the time the hospital I was working at did incentive pay
Oh, that's good to
um,
hear.
to help people, to help because they were losing, they were just hemorrhaging people.
Hmm.
And then they were bringing in new people who weren't as experienced in that organization, and paying them more than they paid the people that they lost. So they realized like, let's give back to the people who are actually staying, and they gave them raises, kind of contingency raises for a little while. But that it's not sustainable. Like those high nursing rates just weren't sustainable for an organization.
Yeah, it's crazy. COVID messed up so many things, so many things,
Yeah.
and in all healthcare, not like just nurses and not just medics and not just firefighters. It literally just destroyed the entire healthcare system.
It's and they're still recovering from it, right?
Yeah.
Like I think people are still recovering from the burnout and from the you know the increased demand. Um, it certainly hasn't gotten any easier. Like in the emergency department these days, the acuity is just higher and higher and higher. Um, the patients aren't slowing down.
No, people are getting sicker and sicker, and then we have no beds and we have nowhere to put them, so they're just getting stuck in the ER. And then there's no beds clearing up upstairs, so they're being, they're getting admitted into the ER and being down there for 4 or 5 days before they can even get a bed upstairs, which is just not
Not
appropriate.
ideal. Yeah,
No,
because the bottom line is ER nurses are terrible inpatient nurses, right? Like they're not good at that. That's not their skill set.
that you
Um,
said it, not me.
I and I mean it. I mean, there's some nurses that have done that and have that experience. One of the things people always ask me, like, "Hey, Kevin, should I go right into the ER?" And I'm like, maybe. Like, I always tell people, like, if you know in your heart of hearts that the ER nursing is all you want to do, you don't want to be a med surg nurse, you don't want to be an ICU nurse, and the only thing that's going to make you happy is emergency nursing, then go be an emergency nurse. But if you're not sure what you want to do and you're not sure what path in nursing you want to take, then I always tell people, like, start in med surg, start in a tele unit, um, and learn that inpatient role. Because the reality is like a lot of ER nursing right now is inpatient nursing anyway.
Yeah.
And I remember as like I never worked on the floors, I never worked med surg, never worked tele. And I remember when we started having a lot of holes in the emergency department, I remember being like I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be an inpatient nurse. I remember someone saying, well, we had an inpatient person. They're like, well, look at the MAR. And I'm like, what's the MAR?
Yeah.
And they were like, seriously? You don't know what the MAR is? And I'm like, I don't know what the MAR is.
Oh,
I was a born and bred ER nurse. Like, what do
yeah.
I know?
What is
And
oral care? You want me to do oral
oral
care?
care. What? Here, brush your teeth, bro. Go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
But it's just not, and now so much of ER nursing is that inpatient nursing too. So
Yeah, it's true. It's that you get to learn all roles when you're in the ER, unfortunately. You
jack of
know.
all trades, master of some.
Yep. That's a very true story. So, in all of your years in EMS and with nursing, what would you say has been probably one of your worst calls or worst patients?
Gosh, that's a tough question to answer because there's been some that you'll never forget, right? Yeah, and I think in general, I think whenever there's a poor outcome, that's always not ideal. Um, when you're coding one of your own,
Yeah.
um, that's heartbreaking for everybody, and certainly have been through that. Um, One that always kind of stands out that I always remember is one of the last pediatric codes I did when I was living in Albuquerque. We had a pediatric um, code that came in from 911. That came in as an ambulance call, and the mom tried to take the child in the car first from home, take the child in the car and put him in the car, and she was going to go to the hospital, right? Like kids are small enough, you can just throw them in the car and run and go.
Hmm.
So people forget that if you call 911, care starts when they get there. Um, and she threw this kid in the car, and the kid started to decompensate and get worse while she was on the freeway. And of course, she couldn't concentrate on her driving. Pulled over, called 911, fire rescue, got the kid out and started working the kid. By that time, it was a code. They brought him to our pediatric emergency department, and the child didn't have a good outcome. And anyone who has ever participated in a pediatric code knows that wail of the family members when they find out that their loved one is not going to live, especially a child, and the wail of the mother, and it just is haunting. It just gives me goosebumps just thinking about it right now. Um, and we heard all of that. We heard the tragic cries of both the father and the mother, and the feelings of responsibility the mother had, which of course who knows if it would have changed the outcome had she called 911 immediately or not. Um, and it was just a heartbreaking code. Um, and not long after that, maybe, I don't know, a week or two after that, I happened to be in Walmart with my wife, and we seen this family um, at Walmart. And I was like, I seen her and spotted her and immediately knew who she was. And she looked at me and she was looking at me like, you look familiar, but I can't place from where. And she's just looking at me like, where do I know you from? And I just told my wife, I'm like, I'm going to go sit in the car, finish this. I got to go. And my wife was like, what's going on? And I had to walk away because I didn't want her to recognize me.
Yeah.
And I seen this family, and they had a shopping cart full of picture frames. And I just remember like
Oh,
the agony in my heart of going, oh my gosh, like they're, every picture this child has ever taken, because this child was taken from them way too soon. Um, it brings that heartbreak right back, like brings you right back to that moment. Um, and I didn't want to bring her right back to that moment. So I was like, I got to get out of here before she recognizes me.
if you saw them today, would you do the same thing?
Yes.
You would?
Yeah. They don't need me dragging up memories. Right. Like, and as much as I would love to just give them a hug and be like, gosh, I hope you're doing well. One of the kind of cool things about being in a small community is in a small community like Albuquerque, you see people again. You see people that and you run calls on people and loved ones of people and sometimes that's hard. Sometimes that's hard.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's both a blessing and a curse.
Hmm.
You know, there's a lot of calls that I could be on where I know that I would do the best for that patient, but it's hard when it's somebody you know and you don't want to disappoint. If they don't have a good outcome, it makes it a lot harder of a call.
Yeah. One of the one of the calls I'll never forget. We had a one of our own at the hospital that came in, and he was coding, and I remember what a tense code. We knew. EMS called and said, this is who this is, and we're on our way, and we were like, oh man, this is going to be bad.
Yeah.
And the physician who had to look after that other physician was, that physician was a mentor to him. And I've never seen that physician lose his cool the way he did in that trauma room that day. And just, fighting the tears as he's trying to resuscitate, someone he loved. And, but he, can give him the best chance that they had when the outcome was, pretty obvious by the time he got there. Um, and you never forget those calls. You never forget those calls that, you know, people or there's lots of calls that you never ever forget, and they just get imprinted in your mind and become part of your story. Become
Yeah.
part of your story, and a story that you can then share and hopefully share with the next generation and kind of help get them ready for dealing with that, dealing with when they do have to have a pediatric code, when they are going to be there for their first code,
Or when they're working one of their own, right?
when they're working on their own.
Whether it's at home or at work.
Yeah, yeah. So it's um it's something none of us want to think about, but it's something that's always a possibility.
A huge possibility, right? We're medical professionals. We are the ones that people look to when something goes wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
It's a tough position to be in. And it's a
Yep.
tough position to be asked to be put in, right?
Yeah, but we sign up for this, right?
We
We
do.
this is we do this because we want to care for people, and sometimes people are our people too. Um, you don't have any regrets. I don't have any regrets. Um, but there's times when it's hard. There's times when it sucks.
What do you do to de-stress in those hard times?
Gosh, to de-stress, I tend to um I don't stress I I don't stress a whole lot. Like I'm pretty hard to stress out, but when I am stressed, I talk to my wife. Um, try to be with family, try to talk to my wife and kind of process things. I like to, I'll call other, because my wife's a civilian. She doesn't necessarily know and how to process everything that we deal with. Sometimes I'll have to call a friend who's also a nurse and be like, hey, let me just verbally vomit on you for a few minutes and tell me that, give me your opinion on this. And you have a small circle of people that you can do that with. So, I try to talk to friends, talk to family, um, and try to work things out when you can.
Do you ever feel bad for laying that kind of information on your wife? Like maybe it was that pediatric code.
Yeah.
Like, would you feel bad sharing that information with her? Because it is a trauma for us, right? So it's going to be a trauma for anybody else that we involve.
One time me and my wife were having a conversation. We said something about deaths or pediatric deaths or something like that. And I don't remember what exactly we were talking about. And I go, oh yeah, I've seen plenty of those. And she's like, you've never told me about those. I'm like, that's not for your little bunny ears, right? Like
Little bunny ears.
you're not ready for that. You're not ready to hear that. And like if I'm having a hard time processing that, like certainly I don't need to put that on you. And and sometimes we don't, to spare them that, if you're married to a civilian who doesn't I say civilian, but you know what I mean.
A
If you're
lay
married to somebody
person.
who's not a lay person, who's not in healthcare, um, sometimes that burden's heavy. And I think we lean on each other, we lean on our team members. And I've certainly have been. I got a call once from a nurse that I worked with a million years ago, and she called me up one day and she was like, dude, I just need to talk. And I'm like, let's talk. Let's do this. And sure enough, she called and she had, one of the heaviest shifts she'd ever had. And I remember talking her through it and going, holy crap, this is a lot. And what she went through was a lot. And it was, she was like, I didn't know who else to talk to about this but you. And I was honored that she made that call and called me and we talked it out. And one of the things I suggested to her at the time, she was really struggling, is I said, you may need, this may require professional help. Like this may be something that you need to talk to a therapist about or talk to somebody about. Um, this may be, this is heavy. This is more than we're going to figure out in this conversation.
Yeah.
We sat on the phone for probably about an hour, just kind of processing. And I was like, this is something you may need to explore further.
Wow, dude. And that's fantastic that you were able to be there for her in that time. And great advice telling her to, seek that professional help, whether she chose to or not.
She
Right.
did. She did.
Good.
And she did seek help, and we still, I still hear from her every now and then. And her beginnings of her, she was EMS before she became a nurse, and her beginnings, were she'd had trauma her whole career and seen trauma her whole career, and this one's just a little too much for her. And we all have that tipping point, or we all have that something that may make that call a little bit harder on you than maybe that it would be on me.
Yeah.
Um, maybe this call is harder on you because it looked like your grandpa. But like I just felt like it was just, just another code. And you never want to be heartless. And I always think to myself, like, I always think about the family. I always think to myself, like, there's family members that are gonna have to deal with this tragedy, this thing that has happened. Um, those are the people I think about.
Yeah, no, we definitely need to be sensitive to the family members. And then we also need to be sensitive to our fellow coworkers, right? Because like you said, something might be a little harder for me than it would be for you, especially if one of us just thinks it's just a code, right? Because
Yeah,
something I've learned doing this podcast is that when you're affected by something, usually it's also depending on where you're at in your life at that moment. So something has triggered
100%.
you. Yeah, something has triggered you, and that's what's got you going, and that can
Yeah,
affect you.
100%. I think that, yeah, there's times in your life. I mean, if you don't have kids, the pediatric code's going to hit a little different than if you have a child who's maybe that age, or maybe that, gender, or whatever the case may be. Um, you never know what's going to trigger those things. We had a code come in, and it was, kind of an everyday code, but I'll never forget, this guy was a nursing student at the school that I went to nursing at, and he was wearing a uniform that I wore.
Oof.
Um, and like it just really bothered me. Like that code really bothered me, and I was really bothered by it. And it was, I felt bad for this kid, and he didn't have a good outcome. Um, but it was one of those that, like, that hit me a little bit different than it hit everybody else, and it's just that one little thing that made it just a little different from me. So I think one of the things that's really important is give your team a lot of grace. Give your team a lot of grace, and you realize that, something that may not hit you may hit someone a little different.
Yeah, definitely be open to it. Do you feel comfortable sharing maybe one of your favorite stories from all of your time?
Gosh, favorite stories. There's so many. I think the stories that I always think about are stories that just made me laugh. Um, I'll tell a story that made me laugh. When I was working in the emergency department as a tech, we had a patient who came in, and the patient was German speaking, and she was there in the hospital, and we were, I was talking to her. I think I was starting her IV or something, and I was joking with her, and I said, okay, like, teach me a little bit of German. And she's like, okay. So she was teaching me a couple words, and I go, if I wanted to pick up a woman in German, what would I say? And she'd say, oh, you would say this. And I practiced it, and she's like, that's good. Yeah, yeah, good, you got it. I practiced it again. And she's like, okay, that's good. You're getting it. So then I walked out of that room, and I went and looked for my friend Uda, who worked in the emergency department with me, who you
Oh,
remember.
Uda.
I can tell
Yeah,
by
I
that laugh,
do. Yeah.
who you remember. And I told Uda this line that this woman just told me. And Uda just looked at me like, what? What did you just say to me? And I said it again, proud of myself, like going, like, I figuring it was something like, oh, you look nice today or something. Well, no, this woman told me essentially something like, hey, you have nice cans. And Uda's like, who taught you that? Like, you didn't just come up with that on your own. Who taught you that? And I was like, this woman in the room down there. And she walked into that room and spoke German to that woman and said, are you trying to get this boy killed? And the woman turned bright red. And she goes, well, I didn't think he was going to try it today. And they ended up having a conversation in German. And it just, it made the patient immediately feel closer to Uda and feel better about her care. And it's just one of the memories that, like, still to this day makes me laugh. Like, here I was trying to be a slick guy, and I ended up saying something completely inappropriate to one of my coworkers.
Yeah, that's definitely a core memory.
Yeah, so there's so many like that. There's so many like little tidbits, and I wish I have a bad memory. I wish I could remember all of the stories, some of these stories, and some of the stories kind of come together. But for as many bad memories as we have, I've had amazing memories of super cool things that happened to me as a nurse, and super amazing things that I've been a witness to. I've been a witness to miracles. That you would never think would happen, and it's been an amazing career. It's been an amazing journey.
It sounds like an amazing career.
We had a patient not too long ago who was a elderly gentleman who was in the hospital, or I'm sorry, his wife was in the hospital, and she was his primary caregiver. He was much sicker than she was for much longer, and she was his primary caregiver. She came into the hospital because she was very, very sick, and the family was like, I don't know who's going to take care of dad because he's like, mom is his caregiver. And so a couple of days later, he ends up in the emergency department too. And they both ended up in our inpatient units. And sure enough, mom was going to pass. Mom was passing and actively dying. And she was DNR, DNI, and everyone felt good about it. And the family was all there. And sure enough, she passed. And about the same time she passed, uh, dad started becoming bradycardic. He was in the same hospital, different floor. She was in the ICU. He was not. He started becoming bradycardic, and the nurse called and she goes, "This guy's getting bradycardic. This may be our next code." And he was a DNR, DNI, and um, I was like, "That's his wife just passed." And they're like, "What?" And I was like, "Yeah, his wife just passed." And I had to be the one to go in and tell the family, "Well, I know you guys are grieving here. However, we seem to have a something changing downstairs." And I go, I'm afraid dad may not be far behind. And sure enough, within an hour, he passed too.
Wow.
And I'm like, whoa, how does that happen? Like, that's like, I was blown away. Like, I'd never experienced that in my career. But sure enough, I think it was probably within an hour of one passing, the spouse passed too. And it was such an amazing thing. And the family, for a family who had experienced two deaths and such a short period of time, like it felt good. Like they were like, okay, this is the way it was supposed to happen. This is how it
Yeah.
was all going to go down. And they were like, this is a miracle. This is, who knew? This is some kind of divine intervention that we can't explain.
You know
So
that wife walked downstairs and said, "You better get your ass up and let's go. We're going together."
she's like, we're out. Let's go.
Yeah.
Come on, we're leaving this place.
Oh,
Um,
that's beautiful. That's
and
beautiful.
and yeah, it was just an amazing story, and just still to this day, like gives me goosebumps to think about. Like they passed together. So
Yeah, that's amazing. It's counterintuitive to say that there is beauty in death. You know what I mean?
yeah,
But when we see as much death as we do, you really do cherish the ones that go so peacefully and so well, and whether it's prepared or not, it's just a
yeah.
a big deal.
I think every EMS provider, every nurse would agree that there's good deaths and there's bad deaths. And when you have a good death and you feel okay about it, you're like, okay, this is okay. And I've never been the one to say that, so someone said on my podcast the other day, and it has just stuck with me, is, you know, if grandma had a low quality of life before she coded, like CPR is not going to make anything better.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan for saying, hey, you know what, like let's allow a natural death and allow what nature to take its course and allow things to happen the way they're supposed to happen without our medical intervention, if that's what the family chooses. And sometimes that's a good thing.
I agree.
So
And sometimes it's not the family's choosing, right? Like
yeah, sometimes it just happens.
that can be hard. That can be hard.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I think most folks, when someone dies, I think you always kind of you take a minute, you appreciate the fact that you got to be there in that moment. You got to be there for those people. You did the best you can. And, sometimes we can't win them all, unfortunately.
No, we can't, but we also need to learn to be okay with that.
Amen. Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard because nobody likes to lose. And it feels like a loss when sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's like, the win is that this was a short code. But it feels like a loss, and it feels like you want to save everybody, but not everybody is to be saved.
And not everybody wants to be saved.
Yeah, not everybody wants to be saved. Yeah. True.
All right, Kevin, I just want to give you the opportunity to, talk about anything that we might not have talked about in the previous part of the episode.
Gosh, well, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm honored to be here. If people are interested, check out my podcast. It's called Art of Emergency Nursing. It is the one where it's a lot like your podcast. We sit around and we tell stories. We talk about, interesting cases and interesting things that the nurses have been through. It's not as clinical. It's kind of storytelling, just like this one. And then the podcast of How Not to Kill Your Patient, that's a little bit more clinical. There we kind of delve into more clinical topics, but we also talk about social topics as well. Things like burnout, things like violence in the emergency department, things like, legislation that affects nursing, things like that. We've covered a little bit of everything there. So if that sounds interesting to you, check out that podcast. And man, I'm honored to be part of this. I always think of EMS and nursing as two sides of the same coin. They have a very symbiotic relationship. We can't have one without the other. And I've always, one of the things that I learned very early on in my career is when I first was working in a hospital, that hospital very much respected and honored the EMS folks that came through. They would stop, pause, listen to the story, listen to what they had to say, and respect them. And then I went to another hospital where they were like, tell us the story fast and get out because we got work to do. And I really, when I got to that hospital, I really tried to change that culture and bring a little bit of that other hospital with me and try to get people to realize that the EMS is part of the team. And with some amazing nurses, we were able to kind of change that dynamic and really have a good relationship with EMS, which I think is so, so critical.
I agree. We're all one team, and I will admit that I didn't feel as strongly that way until I started in the ER as a paramedic in the trauma ER, where you realize, how much these folks are doing for you and how much a lot of them do actually respect what you do and who you are. And it kind of changed my perspective quite a bit. So it was fantastic. But man, what an amazing conversation. I appreciate you so much. I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much for, giving me that little push to start the podcast when I did. I can't say thank you enough. And having you out today has been, my honor. It's been amazing having you on.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and keep up the amazing work. And you're making a huge difference in the lives of paramedics and pre-hospital providers and hospital providers that are listening to your podcast every week. So keep that shit up.
Well, thanks, brother. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a good day.
Thank you. I hope you do too.
Thank you for listening. Before we wrap up, we have a few important announcements to share with you. Firstly, we're excited to announce the launch of our brand new 911 Nonsense Facebook group page. It's a community where everyone can go to connect, share ideas, discuss topics from the show, and get all of the most recent updates about the podcast. We'd love to have you join us and be part of the conversation. Next, we want to ask you to rate and review our podcast on your preferred platform. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach a wider audience. By rating and reviewing the show, you'll be supporting us in a big way and helping others discover 911 Nonsense. If you enjoy what we do and would like to support the podcast even further, we have a few options available. You can visit samspursuit.com to find the links to our 911 Nonsense merch page and our recently released Noon gear page. Every contribution, no matter the size, goes a long way in helping us continue to better the podcast. We know that not everyone is comfortable being on the podcast, but we still want to hear your stories and experiences. If you have a compelling story and would like to share it to be read by me in a future episode, please reach out to us via email at 911nonsense@gmail.com or through our website's contact section. If you choose to be anonymous, we'll make sure to respect your privacy while sharing your story in a way that resonates with our audience. Thank you again for tuning in. We truly appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more engaging content in the future. See you next week.